Jesus' ways are so different than our ways. Even his closest disciple, Peter, does not get it. A reading from Mark, the 8th chapter. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The word of the Lord. Please be seated. There was once a small plane with just 5 passengers on it. In mid-flight, the pilot came out from behind the curtain wearing a parachute. He said, "Friends, we've had an engine malfunction and we're going down. And I've got some good news and some bad news for you. The good news is that there are several parachutes right there on the wall. The bad news is there are 5 of you and only 4 of them. You'll have to work it out on your own." And with that, he was out the door with his parachute. A woman leapt up very quickly. She said, "I'm one of the most prominent brain surgeons in the entire Northeast. My patients depend upon me." She grabbed a parachute and leapt out. A man stood up and he said, "I'm partner in a large law firm, and the practice would simply fall apart without me." He grabbed a parachute and he jumped out. Another man jumped up. He said, "I am purported to be the smartest man in the world. My IQ..." Well, I shouldn't mention it. It would make you feel so bad. "Surely you understand that I need a parachute." And he grabbed a pack and he jumped out. Now there's only 2 people left on that airplane. A middle-aged pastor. Just a side note here. What does that mean? If I'm 46, 47, do I expect to live to 100 or so? I don't think I'm middle-aged, but maybe I am. Okay, okay. So there's a young guy, a teenager, and a middle-aged pastor of an unspecified number of years of life. And the pastor said, "Son, you take the last parachute. You have your whole life ahead of you." The teenager looked up at him and said, "Thanks, Pastor, but there are still 2 parachutes left. The smartest man in the world just grabbed my backpack." Sometimes we're not as smart as we think we are. But I tell that because in life often we're all in mid-air kinda, and we're clinging to something. And maybe we're doing so as if our lives depended on it. We better hope that we're clinging to the right thing. In our Bible readings this morning, we're confronted with a tough question. Are you clinging to God in trust? Are you clinging to God in trust? And there are a number of ways that we can ask this question, kind of massaging the question a little bit. Do you trust God to come through on the promises God has made? Are you trusting God to lead you and never to forsake you? Are you trusting Jesus When he describes the life that he has in mind for you, are you trusting him enough to live the way that he's invited you to live? Our first two Bible readings, which Leo read, have to do with Abraham and Sarah. The first one is the story, and the second one is basically Paul's, the Apostle Paul's sermon on the story. And you're wondering why I'm preaching a second sermon, I suppose. But Paul's sermon on Abraham and Sarah. You might recall that God promised to the two of them, Abraham and Sarah, three things. He promised that he would give them land. Turns out to be what we call the promised land. He promised them that he would give them offspring, make you the father and mother of many nations. And he told them that they would be blessed to be a blessing, that the nations would be blessed through them. Now, some time had elapsed between the promises that God had made, and initially that came in Genesis chapter 12, and our reading for today, which is in the 17th chapter. Abram, as he was called then, was like 99 years old. His wife, something like 10 years younger than that. And guess what? No kids. Oh, they had already taken matters into their own hands like we want to do. We want to cling to what we want to do, right? Not to the promises. They took matters into their own hands. Sarah gave Abraham her maiden, Hagar. And Hagar had a baby. But this baby was not the child of the promise. The promise that God had made was to Abraham and Sarah that their descendants would be many. It hadn't happened yet. And did I mention that they were old? So old that they had given up on ever having children together. To come back now to the parachute image, they began to let go of God and began clinging to something else for their own security, for their own present, and for their own future. They began to think that God had it wrong. And they knew better than God what had to happen. It's not going to happen God's way. So it's got to happen my way. So I'm giving up on God, letting go. I think we do that too. I think that when we're in midair and feel like we're free falling, we might stop clinging to God. We might stop trusting in God. Just when we need Him the most, we grab onto something else. In our reading from Mark, which I shared with you, there's a lack of trust exhibited there as well. Comes right after Peter's great confession. We didn't start the story back far enough. Peter's great confession that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. You know, Pete, you're right, says Jesus. Then Jesus went on to describe what it meant that he was the Messiah. It meant suffering. It meant rejection. It meant the cross. It meant death. No, says Peter. That can't be. See what's happening here? He's not trusting Jesus. He doesn't get it. He's not trusting. He can't cling to that. And then Jesus, adding to the drama, adds that if anyone wants to be my disciple, my follower, my student, my pupil, they've got to deny themselves. Take up a cross and follow me. Denying, taking up a cross. To me, that sounds like we're falling freely in midair again. How can I trust? And speaking of how can I trust, Jesus says that cross-carrying, self-denying is exactly how we're going to discover the abundant life and the full life and the meaningful life. What? You gotta be kidding! He's not. Do you trust Jesus in that? Are you clinging to that parachute above all else? Or do you want to change this following stuff just a little bit so that it's more like comfort me, love me, forgive me, shepherd me? Oh, I like that message. Now that's more like it. That's got appeal. But that's not what Jesus says in this text here. He talks about denial, self-denial. He talks about cross-carrying. To mix my metaphors a bit here, he gives us his recipe for being a successful follower. A woman once wrote into, I think it was probably Reader's Digest or something like that. She wrote this: when my sister-in-law Jenny cooks, she likes to substitute ingredients. Anyone like that out there? Mm-hmm. My wife often cooks and she says, "You like this?" And we say, "Yep. Good thing you'll never have it this way again." Anyways, that's not what I was going to talk about. But when my sister-in-law Jenny cooks, she likes to substitute ingredients. One time I gave her a recipe for a chicken and walnut dish that her husband, which would be my brother, likes. And she served it one time when I was over there. Well, in place of walnuts, she used peanuts. And for chicken, she substituted beef. In fact, every major ingredient had been replaced. "This is terrible," my brother said after one bite. Jenny glared across the table and said, "Don't blame me, it's your sister's recipe." Jesus tells us the recipe for what it means to be a follower. Denial, cross-carrying, trusting, believing, clinging to Jesus as that parachute. But Peter doesn't like it. Maybe like you and I don't like it. He wants to change that recipe. He wants to change the formula. He wants to change the instructions. All of this suffering and dying business. Well, this isn't good for business, Lord. This isn't what I'm understanding the Messiah to be all about. And it really doesn't fit his understanding about what he wants to do with his life in service to God and walking Jesus' footsteps. That's not the way it's supposed to go. That's not right. That's not the formula for success. We've got to change that, he says. Instead of we've got to cling to that. Trust. Abraham and Sarah, well, they learned. They experienced God coming through on God's promises, including being the matriarch and a patriarch of the entire nation of Israel. Father Abraham had many sons. You know that one. Trusting God. Peter learned that too. Oh, it took a little while. Even though he was dismayed and perhaps depleted and forlorn at the suffering and death of Jesus, he learned. He experienced the risen Jesus. Remember on Easter? Jesus says to the women, "Go tell the disciples and Peter." Yes, and Peter. And Jesus loved Peter. And Jesus forgave Peter. And Jesus emboldened Peter so that Peter could tell the world about this Messiah who had to suffer and die for our sake. Oh, easy to be bold in my proclamation this morning. But truth be told, there are so many times that I grab onto the wrong parachute. And even when I know I'm doing that, I think it's because I'm scared. I'm scared of crashing as I'm in midair here falling. And that's sometimes what life feels like. I'm afraid of crashing. And so I want to be in control. And I start changing the recipe that Jesus gave us for the abundant life and the meaningful life. People, that's my self-centeredness. Are you with me on that? You understand that? But what I see in these texts is a radical call to a radical trust. To trust that God is good and God knows best, even if in the immediate circumstances it does not make sense. The full life is denying self. That's the recipe. The full life is being other-centered. That's the recipe. It's about loving and serving God by loving and serving others. That's the recipe. It's about being blessed to be a blessing and experiencing blessing as we do that blessing of others. That's the recipe. Can you take a leap of faith with me? Can you take a leap of faith and this week do something to serve someone else? As you do so, you'll be clinging to the right parachute. That's Jesus. The full life, the abundant life comes as we choose to take up our cross. And taking up our cross is a choice that we make to sacrifice on behalf of someone else. It's something that we take on or pick up on behalf of someone else. It's the kingdom work we choose to do, even if it's tough. Can you take a leap of faith with me this week and find something to take up? It might mean sacrifice. Yeah, it might. Of your time or of your resources. It might take that sacrifice to make a difference in someone else's life. Self-denial and cross-carrying are the ways that the kingdom comes, that the kingdom breaks in for those we serve and for us as we serve and deny and carry crosses. That's the recipe for a life of following. That's the parachute that will land us safely on the solid rock.